Morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining the call for the Western EIM-based scheduled submission deadline initiative. This is to talk about the draft final proposal that was issued on October 30th. My name is Christina Osborne. I'm with ISO Stakeholder Affairs. I'm going to be facilitating the web conference. Also joining me on the speaker line from the ISO, Danny Johnson, who will be the main presenter, and he's also the policy lead for this initiative. We have Don Trethewey, James Lynn, John Anders, Nick Mesner, Rahul Kaliskar, and Virginia Thompson. First off, Danny's going to go over the background of the initiative, and then he's going to summarize the stakeholder comments and discuss at a high level the changes from the last proposal, and then he'll go into more details of the draft final proposal. So we are in the draft final proposal phase, as shown here. I'll go over the next steps at the end of the proposal, but we are intending to go to the EIM Governing Body early December and then the ISO Board of Governors in mid-December. So the presentation, I did post an updated version this morning. We just had a minor update, but it is available out on the initial webpage. We also will be recording the meeting today. We will make that recording available to stakeholders out on the initial webpage. Usually it takes a couple of business days for us to receive that from AT&T. So it should be posted by the middle of next week. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Danny Johnson.
Thank you, Christina. So for anybody who's not overly familiar with the topic or who missed our straw proposal meeting, I have a single slide on background for this initiative. This initiative deals with updates to how EIM entities submit base schedules. So a base schedule is a forward energy schedule with hourly granularity. That is the baseline to measure deviations per settlement through the EIM. It is also tested to ensure that EIM entities bring sufficient capacity and flexibility to the EIM, and passing it is what predicates their ability to access incremental EIM transfers. So these base schedules are submitted at 3 periods prior to each operating hour, T75, T55, and at T40. The T40 EIM base schedule is the final base schedule that the ISO accepts. Additionally, energy below a resource's minimum load cannot currently be included in a base schedule. Next slide. Okay, so now as Christina mentioned, we're going to go over the stakeholder comments and changes to the proposal at a high level. Next slide. So on the first topic of moving the deadline from 40 minutes prior to the operating hour to 30, EIM entities offered general support. Idaho Power and PowerX highlighted potential limited benefits in the straw proposal, mainly highlighting that the EIM entities themselves gain this additional time. Many EIM entities requested also moving the T55 base schedule submission deadline to T50 as a way to create additional benefits for their transmission customers. The mechanics of facilitating this request would require the ISO to shrink the solution time for the RTPD interval that currently initiates at 52.5, RTPD6. It's not something that we initially considered within the scope of this initiative, and it's not something we plan to put in this initiative. However, we do commit to performing testing on this change while we implement this initiative. We'll publish those results, and should this change prove feasible, we could pursue it through the normal CAISO stakeholder process. Next slide. So multiple stakeholders also requested the CAISO retain the T40 RSE as an advisory run. SRP in particular raised a reliability concern that the revised submission deadline of T30 would not allow sufficient time for manual balancing actions to be taken following a potential failure of the T30 RSE. The concern boils down to somebody has to interpret these results and then take manual actions to turn on additional resources or schedule additional resources for that first 15 minutes in the next operating hour, and 30 minutes may not be enough time to regularly do that. The CAISO hosted a call on October 28th with this as the primary topic. This reliability concern was echoed by other EIM entities on that call. So in light of the broad support for keeping a T40 RSE and its ability to help potentially mitigate SRP's reliability concern, the CAISO is proposing to run an additional RSE at T40 within the scope of this initiative. And I'll go into a little more detail on the mechanics of that in the proposal section. Stakeholders also question the performance implications of this change, how it may impact nodal FRP, and ask for the results of the performance testing the CAISO has completed to date. The CAISO has completed performance testing. However, it was with our current market software. It did not include the changes that will be brought upon by nodal FRP. This testing is not really indicative of if we will be successfully able to implement this without issues with nodal FRP. So in light of this, the CAISO is proposing to implement this change concurrent with nodal FRP, but we will delay the activation of this in production until our testing shows no performance concerns would result from this initiative. Next slide. Moving on to the startup energy component of this initiative, stakeholders expressed broad support for this proposed change. Some members that are full CAISO participants requested the ISO investigate this functionality. This would be something we're interested in, but would be a dramatic expansion of scope of this initiative, as it would require us to really change how our market optimization works to get it to include startup energy. That same reason is why we will not be able to facilitate the request for a dispatch operating target for this startup energy. I want to reiterate the intended scope of this part of the initiative is just to allow startup energy to be included for the purposes of passing the RSE and to reduce uninstructed imbalance charges related to startup energy. Next slide. So stakeholders also requested additional information on the CAISO's proposed validation and monitoring actions. The CAISO's concern on this is that the functionality will be abused to pass the RSE. Currently, someone could obviously submit false base schedules to pass the RSE, but this lowers the burden of doing that, as a resource would no longer have to be represented at its minimum load. It could be represented below there. Any type of validation or automated monitoring to catch this type of abuse would have to be coordinated between our base schedule aggregation portal, settlements, WebOMS. This will be difficult, if not impossible, to implement prior to spring of 2021. So given our concern, but our inability to actually automate and make straightforward to monitor this, the CAISO is proposing to just move to after-the-fact monitoring with identified cases of abuse subject to the CAISO tariff. So that is my summarization of the comments. Does anybody have any questions at this time?
Again, if you have a question, you can raise your hand by pressing #2. Carice, let me know if anybody enters the queue. Anyone in the queue, Carice?
So far, there is no one in the queue.
Okay, we'll go ahead and move on then.
Okay, so the actual draft final proposal and the mechanics of how we're going to accomplish what we're proposing. So we are proposing to move the market closing timeline from 40 minutes prior to the operating hour to 30. This will involve moving the existing RTPD run that starts at 37.5 to initiate shortly after the completion of the T30 RSE. The RTPD interval will still publish by T22.5, which preserves the current time allowed for tagging before the T20 deadline. Again, just to note that the RSE will begin shortly after the T30 base schedules are due. Next slide. So we are proposing to create or add a RSE at T40. You could view it as preserving the existing RSE or adding it. We do not intend this to be advisory. This will be an RSE similar to the T55 or T75 RSE. So the inputs that we are proposing to use in this resource efficiency evaluation will be the variable energy resource and load forecasts for T7.5, which are currently locked at T55, and the initial resource conditions determined by the RTPD interval that starts at T52.5. these are all the inputs that are currently used in the T40 RSC. We are also proposing to use this same set of inputs in the T30 RSC. We think that this should create the following benefits. We will align the inputs, which will reduce the variability between the final two RSCs, as the initial conditions for resources will be the same in the T30 and the T40 RSC. One of the concerns that we heard on the October 28th call was that the different initial conditions used between the previous T55 and T40 RSC led to resources being either changed on their operating point or changed in their MSG configuration even, which was leading to failures of the T30 RSC. So that problem should be largely eliminated because these last two RSCs will use that same input. Hopefully this will aid EIM entities' ability to more regularly pass that final T30 RSC. Additionally, since the T30 and T40 RSCs will use all of the same inputs with the exception of what is at the discretion of the EIM entity, should an entity fail the T40 RSC, they should be able to evaluate if they think they can pass the T30 RSC, and if not, begin taking the manual balancing actions at T40, which is the same time frame which they currently take those actions at. So this preserves, hopefully, an EIM entity's ability to take manual balancing actions if necessary. This is a diagram of the revised timeline. As you can see, it just shows which RTPD tests feed into which RSC, or which base schedule RSCs. At the bottom, it also shows that the RTPD5 will begin a little later. I think at this time, I'd like to pause for questions to see if anybody needs any clarification on anything.
We do have a question for the phone.
Great. Go ahead, Chris.
Your line is unmuted.
Good morning. This is Ryan from Portland General. I wanted to ask a clarifying question. Based on this proposal, it looks like CAISO is going to shift the real-time pre-dispatch 5 to a later date or later time after T30. So I just want to clarify, would we still get the T40 test result at T-minus 37.5? My understanding is that the timing of this is pretty critical. Don't get guaranteed to get the T40 result fast enough. Keeping the T40 test there would ultimately be less helpful. We recognize that it would still be helpful in terms of getting a unit started up earlier before T30, but if T-minus 40 gets published too late, people won't have time to make any bilateral transactions. Traders need at least 5 minutes to create a tag and finish a deal, and they also need to make sure their system gets the data, can push that data into the CAISO system.
Yeah, so Ryan, thanks for helping to illuminate that. You are correct that that timing is critical, and we would plan to publish the results of that T40 RSC as soon as they're done. My understanding is that the actual test takes around a minute, and so it would be published within a couple minutes after that T40 deadline. We would not plan on holding, we don't see any benefit in holding those results. We're trying to give them to you early to help with your decision making.
Thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions, Carice?
That was the only question in the queue so far.
All right, thank you.
So moving on to the second item within this initiative, this would be the startup energy below minimum load. Our proposal proposes to allow startup energy to be accounted for in a resources-based schedule. We want to include this for the purposes of passing the RSC. This should reduce uninstructed imbalance energy charges related to startup energy. And again, all monitoring will be performed on an after-the-fact basis. Misuse of this functionality will just be subject to the CAISO tariff in the same way that any other misuse of a base schedule that is submitted to the ISO. Next slide.
Okay.
So I think that's all I have. I'd like to pause one more time to see if we have any questions before I turn it back over to Christina.
We do have
again, so press pound 2.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Grace.
Hey, this is Roger with the Department of Market Monitoring. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hey, Roger.
Hey, Roger.
Okay, yeah, I just had a question on the submission of the startup energy. Is I still going to consider that if an entity submits this startup energy that the entity is intending to start the unit, they can consider that as a declaration that they're starting up?
I'm not sure I followed what the question was, Roger. Are you just asking clarification if that's how we would view it?
Yeah. Yes. Like, how do you view
Yeah, we would.
mission?
Yeah, we would view startup energy shown in a base schedule as an EIM entity is intending to start that resource. And if that's not clear in our draft final proposal, we can make that clear in our further board docs and going forward in all of our additional write-ups on this.
Okay, sure. Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger.
Thanks, Roger. Anyone else in the queue?
Yes. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hey, this is Ramon Mitchell of Pacific Corp. I have a small question on the uninstructed imbalance charges, and that is, how would the uninstructed imbalance energy be calculated for startup energy? You'd be comparing the metered output to what?
To the base schedule that you would have submitted, that includes that startup energy. So if you show 10 megawatts of startup energy for that 15-minute interval, that's what we're going to compare your metered output to.
Okay, so it would be the metered output across the hour compared to that hourly base schedule. Would it be?
Yeah, there's a bit more. I'm sorry, go on.
No, you're probably going to answer my question a bit more nuanced.
Yeah, I was going to say, I believe in the straw proposal we kind of detail out how this would be calculated, I think. But yeah, it's just the startup energy that you would expect during each 15-minute increment within the base schedule, and just represent that. And then that's what we will be metering against, or that's what we will be validating the meter data against.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions?
Yes, we have one more question in the queue.
Okay.
Your line is unmuted.
Hey, this is Jay Chongzhao with Portland General. I just want to ask a clarification question about the mean load. So what's the difference between, I just wanted to understand the difference between the OMS and the master file here. So if I have a master file PMIN of 100, but we have an automated ambient process that has a 120 megawatt of PMIN ambient, then can I submit a schedule that are only below the ambient, but it still has to be above the master file, or it could even be below the master file value?
So I believe that the outages entered in WebOMS would overwrite the master file limits if they are changed from the master file limits. So the base schedule should be submitted with the OMS limitations considered.
Okay, but my understanding here that this proposal is to allow entity to submit a schedule below the mean.
Yeah, and so
yeah, right. So my question is, would the master file still be treated as a hard mean that it can never go below that master file?
Yeah, I think I understand your question a little bit more. So my understanding would be WebOMS would be more likely with an ambient D rate to reduce the maximum output of the generator. I've never seen a WebOMS card that would change P-min. So master file would be your default minimum limitation. If your minimum got changed via OMS card, then that would be what we would respect. And actually thinking this through, there are some resources that would have a PMIN re-rate. So whatever would be in WebOMS would be what the most accurate snapshot of what your resource can perform at, and is what we would expect to be reflected in the base schedule.
Okay, I guess I'm not fully following. I guess, sorry, we do have PMIN re-rates sometimes on unit, but what I was trying to ask is, can I submit a schedule that is below the master file, or I can only submit a schedule below the re-rate, but it still has to be above the master file PMIN?
Can you say that one more time? I'm just not following.
Yeah, sure. So assume that I have a master file PMIN 100 megawatt, and then I have a re-rate. I have a re-rate of 150. So this proposal would allow me to submit a schedule below the min load. I'm just trying to get a clarification of what min load that Kaisa is referring to here. Is the min load is the minimum
schedule?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, below below either of them, if that's what your intent was. So say you're starting up in that first 15 minutes, you're only at 20, and you're hoping to get to 150, then that's fine too.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Chris, do we have anybody else in the queue?
We have one more question in the queue.
Okay.
You are unmuted.
Hi, this is Christy Monahan with SRP. I just wanted to ask, make sure I understood the discussion on the PMIN. So we also use PMIN uprates for ambient reasons. And so it sounds like we are able to submit startup energy even if our PMIN re-rate is in place. Is that a correct statement?
Yes.
Okay. I have another question as well. I didn't see in the proposal that all resources would be impacted by the base schedules below PMIN. So is it a correct assumption that all resources, NPRs, PRs, MSGs, non-MSGs are all included in this?
Yes, it is our intent that all resources within an EIM area would be able to utilize this functionality.
Okay. Another question I had was there was a comment on the intention to start a resource, and I was also wondering if test energy would be a viable reason for submitting a base schedule below PMIN.
Our intent would not be to include test energy within this initiative at this time. So I think it could be, but that's not what we would intend this to be for. We want it to represent when a resource is starting up.
Okay. There may be cases where a resource is testing and starting up as well. So I think that would still meet the startup criteria, but it may be longer than a typical startup. So in that case, the way I read it was that would still be an acceptable use. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. I think what Roger was trying to get at earlier, which we do intend to clarify, is we want the energy that is shown below PMIN to be reflective of when a resource is starting up and ramping to PMIN.
Okay. As far as bidding, when a unit is in startup, do you anticipate any changes to allowing or not allowing bids per the cyber rules or base schedules below PMIN?
We do not plan on allowing energy below PMIN to be bid. It just needs to be shown on a base schedule.
Can the bid be in place for I guess I should phrase it, the bid curve. Can the bid curve extend from the PMIN to the PMAX on that configuration or that unit, and that bid still be in place, or do we need to ensure there are no bids at all for that unit during startup?
I think the bids can be for energy above the minimum load.
Okay, thank you. That helps. And then the last question I had was, we have our optimizer, which produces our base schedules, and these schedules may be produced ahead of the T75 deadline. So the rolling nature of these could produce schedules that that may flip-flop between either starting or not starting, depending on economic commitments or even reliability commitments that we have. Is documentation, what kind of documentation would be necessary to show that there were reasons for submitting base schedules that might appear to disagree with some of the rules in the proposal?
So I think what you just said there would be fine documentation. If your optimizer results showed that the resource would be starting up and would not be based on the next RTPD interval that the ISO runs, then having those results would be helpful in clarifying that the startup energy was not being submitted or erroneously, that it was actually intended to be submitted. And then just to be clear, what we'll be looking at is the startup energy on the final submitted base schedule.
Okay, thank you.
That's all the questions we have in the queue.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate the questions. And so on to the next steps, because we are looking for stakeholder comments. But before I go there, this is regarding the EIM Governing Body classification. So the ISO believes that this initiative falls within the EIM Governing Body's primary approval authority. The T-40 and T-30 change, while generally applicable, is intended to address EIM-specific issues, and while only EIM entities will be able to submit energy below a resource's minimum load within their base schedule. So these two items pass the identified test, but we are looking for stakeholder feedback on this classification. And so we are asking, we have the holidays coming up, and also we have to get the memo in for the EIM Governing Body, so we are looking for comments to be submitted next Friday, November 13th. We did publish a comments template out on the initial webpage. We asked, well, you should be submitting your comments through that tool. And we will be going to the EIM Governing Body December 2nd, and then go to the ISO Board of Governors December 16th and 17th. So any other comments or questions before we end the call today? Again, press #2 to raise your hand.
We do have a question in the queue.
All right.
Your line is unmuted.
Hi, for those of us that are just joining the EIM in April, would this going to the board towards the end of December, would this possibly be in effect by April 1st?
So this is Danny. That is our plan, that if we can get this to the board and it is approved in December, we would file at FERC immediately after, and then ideally get this functionality, especially the startup energy, in place by April 1st, and then the T40 to T30 would be fall of 2021.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
All right, any other questions?
We have no further questions in the queue.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it, and hope you enjoy the weekend ahead.